Welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. Today we have a conversation that I have been waiting for with bated breath for the last few weeks. It is with Helen De Cruz, who is a professor at St. Louis University who studies the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the development of scientific thought. She caught my eye because she wrote a book about the role of wonder in the evolution of science around the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and is a big fan of Descartes. If you guys are listening to the show frequently, you know that we tend to think that the division between Newton and Descartes was incredibly valuable for everything that came downstream in the sciences. And this is the first conversation where we got to talk about it.
Yeah, I don't know if it was valuable or destructive, but there's certainly some sort of explosion that happened there. Of course, Descartes was of the mindset that the universe should function something like a giant machine, and Newton was satisfied to say the way that it functioned using mathematics, so to describe the events as they unfolded, and to leave cause the heck out of things. It's not the job of the natural philosopher to explain cause. So that's a huge fracture, and it's played out up to the present moment. And moreover, Helen's really interested in the way that the Renaissance changed the ability of people to communicate about new ideas for the first time. We trace some of that back to the printing press, but there's all sorts of interesting parallels to what's happening today with the internet and the attempts by the state to squash information that they don't like. Of course, that was happening back then too. It didn't work out, newsflash. And so we're looking at a potentially really similar future to what happened back in the Renaissance in this very moment. We're really excited about it, and this is a good chance for us to explore those ideas.
Absolutely. And so if you enjoy the conversation, you can pick up Helen's book. We have a link in the description, which is actually an affiliate link, which means that we get a couple pennies if you buy the book, and it helps Helen out as well. If you want to support the podcast in a way that is more direct, consider coming over to patreon.com. We have a link right here. And in return for a couple dollars a month, you get to come to our weekly patron chat where it's a behind-the-scenes analysis of the big ideas that we talk about on the podcast. And we would absolutely love to see you there because Patreon support is what allows us to make this podcast. No strings attached, no editorial direction, no interstitial advertisements where we tell you about, long underwear and razors. We're free.
Yeah, we got no bosses. Nobody's telling us what to do, and we're not selling anything. So please make sure this kind of investigation... Oops, I'm looking at the wrong camera.
We got no bosses.
We got no bosses. Nobody's telling us what to do, and we want to keep it this way. So please support our podcast, support other podcasts like ours, but especially ours. And come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and shave off a few dimes for us.
If you have already done that and you want to get even more involved, come to our conference that's happening in Austin, Texas, April 7th and 8th. It's going to be 2 days of talks, workshops, hanging out, actually seeing each other in person, and it looks like it's going to be a really intimate and fun event. Live stream tickets are also available. Check them up here.
All right, enjoy our conversation and let us know your thoughts in the comments.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I loved reading books, but my parents were not bookish people. So my parents, this was like working class family. So my father was a bricklayer in his working life, and my mother was a homemaker. So the most books we had were, for the most part, cooking books and a few books on pedagogy, because my mother did train to be like a kindergarten teacher, but then she didn't do it because it's really tough to be a kindergarten teacher. It's really difficult. And so those were the most books that we had at home. And so I discovered the library when I was about 9, and I could read reasonably well, the village library. It was very close to my school. And so I'd quickly read most of the children's books that were there, and I wasn't that interested in children's books. And then I sort of wandered off into other places. And then there was this book with drawings by Leonardo da Vinci. and that was it was a catalog, I think, of an exhibition, and it just literally was drawings by Leonardo da Vinci. And I was sort of really transfixed by this person. Like, to be that sort of mind, right? Of these inventions and the art. Like, I was just amazed that somebody could be like that. Like, both be interested in really technical stuff and also be interested in, artistic stuff. And that's basically what started me in thinking about the Renaissance. And I got really into it. And I was just such a big Renaissance fan. So I in my early teens, I saved up money so that my mother and I could go to Florence and Rome and things like that. So it was like, it was an intellectual discovery journey, I would say.
Was that a unique period where you think these, we have this idea of the Renaissance man. Like, was this a unique moment where somebody could hold all of these things in their mind? And the reason I ask is because it seems today, especially intellectuals, really tend to specialize in one thing. And so the idea that you would be, a world-class artist and a world-class scientist I just can't even think of any examples of that, like that you would have somebody embodying such different things in the world.
It's funny because people sometimes will have polymath in their bio on Twitter, but they're not real polymaths, when you go
It's a bold thing to put in your bio.
Yeah.
Twitter is not for humility. I think.
No. I mean, you don't go there if you're a humble person. You're not on Twitter, I think. I was intrigued by the idea of the Renaissance man, of this sort of, on the one hand, you had people who genuinely tried to expand knowledge. So in the traditional story of the Renaissance, which later I came to realize only decades later that the story is wrong. But at the time, when I was first into it, the story was presented as you had the Middle Ages and people were super ignorant, right? And then they sort of realized, oh, wait, there's all these classic things, like there's all these Roman authors, and look at amazing architecture that they did. And there's all these playwrights, and let's go back to that and let's expand our knowledge further. So that's sort of the story that you hear about the Renaissance, that has to be nuanced. But at the same time, they didn't think the way we think of knowledge now. They thought of knowledge as this integrative project where, to give just one really strange example, we wouldn't think that there's any reason to suppose that the intervals in music would be similar to the distances between the planets in the solar system. Like, why would there be any similarity? But they thought so, like people like Kepler. Now we're talking sort of more the early modern period, end of the Renaissance. They thought that this was the case. So that sort of mindset where music, insights from music, can feed into your astronomy was I think a very unique way of looking at the world that I kind of feel we lost a little bit now, and I think for the worse. I do think that actually science works better if there are these sort of the insights from the humanities, from the arts, etc., on scientific knowledge acquisition. And in fact, I'd say that I was just reading about Einstein recently for a completely different project, that actually this was the case until fairly recently. So, for example, somebody like Einstein would say that he actually got from humanities all sorts of insights that he used in his science.
Yeah, he had a very poetic way about him. I think that's probably what contributed to his legacy. He's almost a god in science, I would say, at this point.
I know, yeah.
I think that there's something really, really important about that artistic aspect of us, which, like you started out with, doesn't really have space for us anymore.
It's hard to imagine Tom York being also an incredible scientist on the side or something like
publishing
that.
Nature papers and being the lead singer of Radiohead. It's laughable that could possibly be the context in which ideas and art were created.
It's very strange. Do you think that that will reappear in the future?
I think so. I think, to be honest, I'm now working on a paper with a team. The paper hasn't appeared yet, but one thing we're doing is we're interviewing scientists, and we're talking about the relationship between religion and science in their work. 35 natural scientists, many of them sort of like they are really cutting edge. Like there's people there who like have contributed to the discovery of the nanograph that you might have seen a while ago. And they actually do read philosophy. I was very surprised by that. Like there's a self-selection effect there, but they do. They do read philosophy and they are influenced by it. So in a sense, it hasn't completely gone away. It's just that somehow in our public discourse, so when they write their papers, they're not going to say, oh yeah, and by the way, when researching this, I was really actually also inspired by, I don't know, Leibniz or something. Like they're not going to put that in their papers, even though they might be inspired by Leibniz. So it's in a sense always there. So that's why I think it's, it might just as well become more prominent because it's never gone away.
I always thought it was sort of ironic that we get doctors of philosophy, but we don't have to take a single philosophy course while we're there.
Yeah.
Very strange.
Very strange, yeah.
Hold over.
So what is this missing piece of the Middle Ages? Because you say that you got into the Renaissance, and the conventional story is that Renaissance comes out of pure darkness. The Middle Ages were cold, brutish, short, empty, ugly, dark. And really, in order to find any kind of reputable or worthwhile culture, we have to go all the way back to the Romans, because the Romans were like the last opportunity of greatness. And you're like, that's not actually the case. And so what's it look like? What did you find?
I think for me personally, I got into medieval history and art, and it's still very much like a dark spot in my knowledge. So like I'm not an expert by any means, but one reason I got really into it is that medieval music is so beautiful and has so many innovations. Like the amount of music theory that they did was quite astounding. So I love listening to old music. And I thought, like, yeah, people who make this music, they can't truly be brutish and ignorant and whatnot. Like you don't make that kind of music and not have some thoughts behind it. And it's kind of interesting. Like I currently teach at a university that is actually so my colleagues, many of them, like Eleanor Stumps, Susan Brower-Toland, are experts in medieval philosophy, and it's really interesting what innovations they got. Like I'm just giving one example: Occam's razor. So Occam's razor is this idea that you shouldn't multiply ontological entities beyond necessity, and there's many formulations of that. But it's really intriguing to see, like William of Ockham was a medieval philosopher, but he did have this idea that you have to be elegant, you have to be concise, you have to think carefully about like what you do. And there are some things in medieval philosophy that are so, I think, discussions we can still learn a lot from. Like, for example, about teleology. Like, does nature have inherently some sort of purpose or drive? So there's lots of so you have the Arabic and Islamic world, medieval philosophers like Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and then you have Aquinas who drew on Ibn Sina. So there's a lot of complexity there in the thinking. So then it becomes an interesting challenge to think like, okay, what's new then? Like if people in the medieval times really made like observations, astronomical observations that were elegant and interesting, like we now laugh with the epicycles, but aren't they beautiful, right? The epicycles, right? This is
extremely accurate too.
They're accurate. You can do all sorts of cool stuff with them. And the natural philosophers, they did use observation, right? So, and they made theories. So what's different? Like we now also have observation and theory. So what's different? So that's something that I've been struggling with. Like, okay, is there something that happened then in the Renaissance? Is there something that we did differently? And I think now the best explanation that we have of what is different is actually that in Renaissance philosophy and in early modern philosophy, particularly, what people really began to embrace is the weird and the quirky, the odd, the irregular, the unicorn's horns in the cabinets of curiosity, the weird stuff. Like that's why they dabbled in magic. So like magic really, really rose in the late medieval period and the Renaissance, and that, even though they never stopped, of course, alchemy, you have it throughout the Middle Ages, but it became this really prestigious and prominent discipline. You could be hired in courts as an alchemist, and that is just like, that is different, I think. The willingness to look at the weird stuff.
Now, before we get on to the Renaissance, I want to understand who was cultivating, what was the harbor for all of this intellectual work that was being done, from the music to the mathematics? Was this primarily an ecclesiastical pursuit? Was it funded by the church mostly, or were individual rulers supporting different intellectual niches? Like, do you have a sense of that, how it was working? Because I assume there was a change that occurred around the Renaissance with respect to the funding paradigm as well.
It's very complicated, that question, right? So if you look at Renaissance patrons, like one of the great Renaissance patrons was Julius II, who was, of course, an ecclesiastical, power, right? And at the same time, as he was funding scientists, artists, architects, as he was giving loads of money to, like, somebody like Michelangelo or Raphael in making the Sistine Chapel and things like that. At the same time, he was also doing political stuff, so he was trying to sort of like draw the papal state in. But at the same time, you also had like a more and more secular power. So that's an important thing to think about. That I do think that the story is right, that you have the waning of church influence. And church influence waned for various reasons. And one of those reasons was the Reformation. I think it's difficult to understate how completely shattering that was. If the idea that the church had the authority, that they had both the moral authority and the epistemic authority, the knowledge, like that everything was there, was completely shattered if things start to split up. So I do think if you look at the Renaissance, you have people like the Medici, and they were like this very powerful North Italian family, and they were a banker's family. And they basically they funded a lot of people who, did things in music, in art, in science. So I do think that there is a shift towards courts, and then later just sort of secular entities. And much later, when state building begins in the 17th, 18th century, probably starting with France, where you have Louis XIV, Louis XIV, who was a horrible human being, but he did manage to centralize like a lot of art and music and science. Then you have like the academies that begin, so that becomes more and more uh, a sort of secular centers that begin to be involved in knowledge production and art production, or to fund it at least.
It's such a crazy thing to think about now, this time period, because it seems like it mirrors in some ways the time period that we're living through right now, where you have things being kind of the same for a period of time, and then all of a sudden there's a technological change, and the technological change sets in motion all of these downstream ripples. And so when I think about this time, I can't help but think about the invention of the printing press
Oh yeah.
as the thing that allows the Reformation to even be set in motion to begin with, because all of a sudden you have the ability to distribute what amounts, it's a leaflet campaign to some degree, right? It's the ability for people first to read the Bible and then afterwards to print mass distribution of whatever ideas they have without having to gather those people in one place. And it so transparently mirrors what we're going through with the internet. And I wonder, by looking at that time period, can you trace a thread that you can also see a reflection of today in terms of institutions and technology and what it's enabling people to do and how it affects power structures and that whole arc?
I do think that, yes, there's important similarities. So first and for all, with the printing press, what I find very striking, so I play a lot of old music. This is not tangential to this, I promise. And one of the things, the way that it's printed, is that it's printed as facsimile. So it's basically a print that looks like the original. And that's the best way to print it, because lute music is printed from tablature. And so what I find very interesting, I always read the royal privilege in the beginning, something like. A lot of pouring of like, oh, this wonderful king, wonderful, duke, wonderful, stadtholder, whatever. You are so wonderful, you're so great, etc. And then I printed this by Laurel Privilege, and I'm now the only one who can print lute music for 3 years in the greater area of Paris, etc. So this royal privilege was one way that I think people were trying to deal with this big danger, right? That you could print anything. You could just print anything, and it's dangerous because, things start to spread horribly. But at the same time,
Misinformation.
If you are listening to this podcast right now and you are enjoying it, I want to ask you a favor. Can you come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and sign up to give us a couple dollars a month? It is a huge, huge gift that you can make to us that hopefully does not alter your bottom line too much. But because of the power of the crowd, it allows us to keep making this podcast, keep working on it full time, keep improving it, keep making it something that is truly a unique place in the entire world. So come over to patreon.com, donate what you can, and we'll see you there.
Misinformation, yes, or like things that they just didn't want printed. So that
It's hard to tell the difference between the two.
it is hard to tell the difference between the two, and it's also so interesting to see how it failed. Like I have so many lute manuscripts that are actually printed without royal privilege, and it's funny how like they did that. Like they would put like a fake city on. Like if you see Amsterdam as a city in the middle 17th century, that's probably fake. It could really be printed in Amsterdam, but it's also like, oh yeah, and in the Dutch Republic, we have no clear oversight about what's happening anyway. And so you might as well, if you printed something in Amsterdam, it's sort of like, oh yeah, and this is why this is a weird book. So it sort of signaled that. Except, of course, funnily enough, you had books like by Spinoza that were printed in Amsterdam, and they had then there's the fake Hamburg. So there's a whole history you can talk about that. But basically, it didn't succeed to try to control this somehow. It was just uncontrollable. And the other thing to realize is that even though the printing press became very important, and also don't forget the importance of the index. Like all of a sudden, you can just go to the index and look at what you're looking for, like without reading the whole thing. Isn't that dangerous? So there were many people objecting to just that fact that you could, or the table of contents, you could easily find where to look, right? So on the other hand,
God, I never thought about the table of contents or the index as a thing that was invented and at the time was a controversial technology.
It was controversial. Like this was something for the printing press. Like you see it in printed books. You don't see it that consistently or often in written manuscripts. But at the same time, people did continue to copy by hand simply because it's not always easy to reach a printing press. So there's a sort of ecology of books. I'll tell you about one specific one just because it lies here on my desk, right? And it's this book here. So this is Taliomed. It's a lot later than the period that I'm talking about. Taliomed or Conversations Between an Indian Philosopher and a French Missionary on the Diminution of the Sea by Benoit de Maillet. So this is a book from 1748. And it's a book that has an evolutionary theory. So it talks about evolution. It talks about that actually life emerged in the sea, right? So it was 1748. And it was so difficult to get this printed, right? Now we don't realize how difficult it was. But Benoit de Maillet, even though he was a French nobleman, fairly privileged, he just didn't dare or could publish this within his lifetime.
Wow.
So he's left instructions for people to publish it after his death. So that happened in 1748. But unfortunately, the person published sort of tried to tone down some of the more radical things in the book. And so the first print that we have of this book, 1748, is actually a sort of a bit toned down with a bit of sort of creationist stuff in it that Benoit de Maillet didn't want. But interestingly, there were people very interested in this book. So this is before Lamarck, before Darwin, before all of those people, right? And they copied it in by hand. So actually the handwritten copies that were circulating are a better reflection of his thoughts than the printed version. So it's complicated, right? You have this ecology of illegal copyings and printings, etc., that went on for centuries, basically, where people were trying to get their ideas out.
Yeah, you see a really similar thing in astronomy and astrophysics. Like, if you try to trace back where our solar system formation models and even our galactic formation models come from, they're essentially the same as the idea that was proposed by Kant back in, I don't know, the mid 1700s.
Yeah.
And it was just sort of, written by a guy who wasn't a scientist at all, and people tried on every idea they could think of in the intervening 200 years, but they landed on essentially the same conception. And it makes me think of how often really brilliant scientific ideas are proposed and then forgotten about for hundreds of years, even in modern times.
And how that relates to where those ideas can be published and how they can be published, right? Because even right now, you have people that in astrophysics have a theory that is challenging some fundamental assumption of star formation or galaxy formation or whatever. And it's hard for a lot of those theories that aren't at the level of like MIT professor to be printed in a peer-reviewed journal. Like they go to either
It'll end up
archive,
in a blog or something, basically, or
blogs,
YouTube.
archive, Vixtra, like all these places that are like lower status, kind of samizdat. And it sounds like you're saying the same thing, which is that in the 1700s, this book with a challenging idea gets printed, but it gets printed smoothed over. It's been shaved down, all the rough edges are off. And the only way that you can actually get access to the real ideas as they truly look is by going to the version that was hand copied and then distributed. And so I feel like that ties back into what you were saying.
Yeah, I'm so fascinated by how these things repeat themselves. That's what's just so interesting to me. Like, I look at the way that the state is trying to manage information on the internet, and it's so fascinating because we know that doesn't work in the long run. And like our entire Western intellectual project is based on this competition of ideas business and trying to curate it and streamline it. It's just so funny because even in our textbooks, like I teach this astronomy course at the university, and all the textbooks love these examples of the church being, beaten down by free thought and the Copernican revolution and all of this. And I'm like, it's so bizarre because the same thing appears to be happening today, except the church is the academy now. And it's so identical in some ways that I'm shocked that we don't realize that we're reliving the same disaster.
Yeah, I think the academy, it's interesting to say, like, one thing that fascinates me about the early modern period is that actually, if you look at the forefront, the people who really were at the, the top of the game were not like in academia. And that's an interesting contrast with the medievals, because if you look at like the great schoolmen, as they were called, the sort of the scholastic philosophers, then they were just generally working at those great universities, like Oxford, Paris, Bologna. But then you have the early modern period, and suddenly you have all these weird people. Like you've got like Descartes. He was a professional soldier. He didn't do all that much soldiering because he was managing to get something out of his writing, but he did soldier for a while. It's kind of interesting. He references it in a couple of things. And then you have like a lens grinder, like Spinoza. So you have all these people that are not professional academics. Then you have people who try to become professional academics, like David Hume, but they fail. So Hume was sort of thinking like, okay, I'm going to try to become wealthy by writing a bestseller. And so he did that several times. And eventually he managed to do it with A History of England, which I think is so funny. So you have all these people who are not academics. And I'm kind of interested that now philosophy is mainly something academic. But at the same time, you have all these YouTube channels, etc. I kind of think it's difficult to imagine something like astronomy, at least the way we're practicing it now, to be something of hobbyists and lay people to be done, because you need computers, you need powerful telescopes, you need a whole infrastructure that the academy offers.
Well, there is the aspect of the interpretive level of that, right? Because the data is, like you're correct, the data needs to be generated by these very powerful technologies, but There's so much, if you talk to academic astrophysicists, there's so much data that's just sitting there, right? Every one of these telescopes is running round the clock. And that data has in the past been freely available. It's less so now. But every once in a while, NASA opens up some sort of portal and they invite citizen scientists to get involved. But there's a lot of work that can actually be done with that data, because the funny thing is that science isn't just making observations and pointing to them, right? There's this whole level of what does that mean? And in astronomy, it couldn't be more opaque what that means, because you can't do experiments. You can't put little tests like stars in a test tube and poke at them. All you have is the light from the sky, and you have to interpret it, what it means. And a lot of those interpretations are built on the backs of successive levels of nested theories and so forth. So I can certainly imagine how that could be revolutionized by people from the outside.
It would be interesting. Like I can imagine. Like I once every month or so I get a letter, and I don't usually answer these anymore because of bad experiences in the past. But they're usually people who have figured it all out. They they figured
We get like one of those a day.
Oh yeah, you get them daily. Like I get them monthly, and I'm sort of thinking, like, yeah, maybe I'm being too close-minded, and there could be something there. And then the likes of me, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, David Chalmers, and a bunch of other people who are on the recipient list will be delighted to find this out. But I think now, like, it's difficult, right? You have things like dark energy, dark matter. Like, it seems to me, as a layperson looking at astronomy, that this is something that's really difficult, that astronomers grasp with, and astrophysicists, like how to even begin to conceptualize it. And yeah, maybe we need a different perspective, right?
I mean, but that conceptualization is exactly the completely open-ended step that anybody could get involved in, is what I'm saying.
Like
when
a professional soldier could sit around and look at the data and, like Descartes, come up with a vision of how it works and fits together. But that person doesn't have the street cred to be able to put forth a theory that is going to get widespread distribution. Like if you think about like writing a bestseller as somebody who's sitting on the outside and has done this interpretive step, like no big publishing house is going to give a contract to somebody that doesn't have a PhD in astrophysics to write a book about astrophysics. Or some enormous pedigree of like, I've been a journalist about astrophysics for, like 20 years. Now I'm ready to write my magnum opus. And yet, I don't think that there's anything that inherently separates us from the kind of intellectual possibility that happened at the time of Descartes. Like, surely that's a universal feature, that the source of inspiration comes external from the system.
Yeah, so I think one thing I'm thinking about is like, there has to be a way to try to at least get some sense of this is worth looking into, and this is probably not worth looking into. And I just don't know, like, that's the thing. Like, you get letters like this every day. I get them a couple of times a month. And this is like, I'm proving here that Einstein is wrong, something we know actually, like he was wrong in many important respects, and that you can actually make perpetua mobilis, like that's nothing to do with it.
That's my favorite one, yeah.
Yeah, and here's like 100,000 words, and you can sort of look a bit at it and make some changes, and then we can publish it together. So like that's interesting, because these people seem to think like, yeah, I can't publish this on my own, but maybe if I send it to somebody who has some street cred, right?
Yeah.
But I don't look at those manuscripts generally, because I have reasons to think that it's not going to work. It's like, I mean, I don't know.
I've actually been dying to talk about this on the show since we get so many of these emails. And like the one thing I realized, like the reason I don't read them usually is because they don't actually peg it to anything that I'm working on. Like if somebody was like, hey, I read this, or I saw this video where you were working on this subject and my work fits into that, and I think that I could collaborate with you, like I could answer some of the questions that you've proposed, I think I would be more inclined. So if anybody's listening to this, please peg it to something that we're actually doing, because I don't have time to just like look at your theory of everything and try to slot it into my understanding of the universe. I don't think that's fair. And so don't send 100,000 words, send a sentence or two, and make it relevant. And maybe we actually can work together. But
I actually have a slightly more constrained perspective on that, where I'm like, I want to work together with people that are already working on stuff. And so if somebody sends me something and they're like, hey, I have Substack. I've published a book. I've done this stuff. I've been working on this for a long time. I've really put a lot of effort into making sure that it's clear and understandable and concise. And I'd love to be able to collaborate on this like very small thing in order to build a relationship. I'm like, that's a really sane request. That demonstrates that it's coming from a place of, I'm working on this thing, I think you'd be a good fit, what do you think? Like how can we relate to one another? As opposed to it just being this bolt out of the blue of like, help me publish my theory. And I'm like, dude, we're all drowning.
Yeah.
Help me publish my theory, yeah.
So I think in the time of Descartes, so you have then what's now referred to as the Republic of Letters, where a lot of scholarly like this was a time that was incredibly disruptive. So if you read about it, like England was pirating Dutch ships and sinking them so that the Dutch couldn't do trade. The English and the Dutch were fighting about New Netherlands, which then led New Amsterdam, which then later fell to the English, and so on. You had the plague, and it sort of swept through a couple of times. You had so much disruption, and so it was difficult to now we have this sort of thing with conferences and stuff like that, but that would have been difficult, right? If you read Letters of the Time, it's really funny. Sometimes it says these things like, oh yeah, and it turns out that what's his name didn't in fact drown at sea. He returned safe and sound at home. And so he's still alive. I think it's so funny. He's still alive. Like the sort of existential insecurity that those people faced, right? So the best way to actually correspond was to write letters. And you had this sort of big networks of letters. And you had somebody like Henry Oldenburg, who we don't remember him as a scientist, but Henry Oldenburg was the secretary he had a secretarial function. I don't remember the function exactly, in the Royal Society of London, which was then just founded or recently founded. And he helped to facilitate an enormous amount of conversations between scientists. And it was that sort of thing, that sort of node of connectedness that helped people to, for example, realize that Descartes' work was really interesting, novel, worthwhile, etc. So there were certain systems in place. Like it wasn't a free for all. Like, yes, this person is interesting to read. This person is interesting to read. And so you also had women in that network, which I think is interesting, in spite of the sexism. It was quite blatant sometimes at the time. So it was certainly not the case that you could just write your theory. You'd almost have to be part of a network to make sure that your theory landed well.
That's exactly what I'm pointing to, where I'm like, I don't think that the theory is the thing that's important. Everybody can have a theory. Like anybody that's got two ideas to rub together can
I guess
put
that's what I'm
together a
pointing to too, is the integration is what's key. Integrate it into whatever else is going on. Make this relevant to me somehow.
I think that the social aspect of ideas cannot be overstated. And so I think that this is why...
By the way, I understand why it's totally shocking to people. Like, when I first had a really interesting scientific idea, I thought everybody in the world would care. Like, I would just go to, message boards and stuff and, say things. And, everybody was just like, shut up, get out of here. Like, we don't need you. This is stupid. And I was just like, whoa, that's crazy. That's not the way that, as a child, I thought science would work. Like, I thought you have a good idea, people will be excited for you. But it's so much more complex than that. It's so much more of a social process that I just wanted to interject that, because it was shocking, and I understand why these people are shocked that everyone's not just dropping what they're doing to look at their theory.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think that there's a technological aspect to this, right? So we have printing press, we have Renaissance, we have Enlightenment. And I just looked, Henry Oldenburg is relatively late in this process. He's 1620s or so, which is already Descartes is working already, Newton's starting to come into fruition.
Yeah, mid-17th century, yeah.
And so they're enabled by the ability to distribute something widely. You can have a network of people writing letters because it's possible to print the letters.
Mm-hmm.
and have 1,000 people or 10,000 people read them, as opposed to having just one person read them.
Not to mention some sort of postal service.
Yeah, and some sort of
Oh,
there's
yeah.
just all these like.
Yeah, that was very important. Like your letter could get lost. So I did a deep dive into Spinoza's letter correspondence, and it's kind of interesting. One reason that it's interesting to look at as a case study is that he wrote so few letters. Like if you do Leibniz, then you're in for misery because he wrote 15,000 letters. I don't know. Like I don't know how this is even possible. Like most of his writing is letters. And Descartes wrote about 800 or so. So Spinoza has only about 80, and that's to and from. So there's 45 letters. So that's really a nice sort of contained amount. And one thing to realize is that the letter, when you write it to, like, for example, when he writes to Oldenburg, or when he writes, this is funny, to Boyle, the early chemist Boyle, where they're sort of like doing experiments together. So Boyle is sort of wondering like, oh yeah, could you like do this experiment and see if it works on your end? And he does it and he says, yeah, this works, this doesn't work. I tasted it, like they taste these chemical things, this nitrate, whatever solution, and it tasted a little bit strange. So things like that. So you knew if you send these letters that people will copy them or print them out. Like it isn't a truly personal letter. So you would begin the letter with a personal bit like, how are you? How's the wife? How are the kids? And then the sort of the central part where the philosophical things happen. And then if you want to send back to me, I'll still be at this address for a few weeks, sort of thing. Because of course it took a while for things to arrive. And unfortunately, sometimes there are letters that are just lost. So that we know like this letter never arrived. So there's still a copy in Spinoza's, in all the paperwork he left behind, but the letter probably never arrived. So there's that thing. So it was reliable, but not like super reliable.
I have a question. Like, in what form did consensus emerge in this climate? If you had all of these letters being shotgunned around the continent, was there some space at which people had a sense of what the state of the art was, or was it really fragmented?
I feel it was fairly fragmented. So that's part of the issue with the difficulty of doing a history of science of this period. For example, there was a big difference between the continent and England at the time. What we now say the United Kingdom. There was a different center of gravity there, and there were different people working there. Part of the issue was that, for example, you had Robert Hooke, and he published this beautiful book called Micrographia. Micrographia is this book where you have like pictures of insects. So he looks through the microscope, he sees beautiful insects, and they look beautiful. So he says, look how wonderful, and God made them, and they're so fantastic looking. And then he looks through the microscope at like a needle, and he says, what? This needle is not sharp, it's like blunt? How is this even possible? And this razor blade, it looks like not even fit to chop wood if it were an axe, is what he's saying. So he says like things made by nature are beautiful and perfect. Things made by humans are pretty bad. So he has this whole interesting philosophical idea about, what the microscope can actually tell us. But he did publish this book. This book was published for wealthy people. And it was sort of like coffee table book. And it was published by the Royal Society, I believe, 1660 thereabouts. But it was published in English because it was really meant for wealthy English people to read. So then when you have Boyle asking Spinoza, what do you think of this book? Spinoza says, I'm sorry, but I don't read English. I'll wait for the Latin edition. So there was that sort of barrier. So you had the beginning where people did write in the vernacular. You also still had many people writing in Latin. So you have a sort of regionalization that makes it difficult to get a clear sense of how consensus was built. And of course, with the whole Leibniz-Newton controversy, it comes to a head, right? That you do see that there are really differences between like science done on the continent and then science done in England. And, then later you have Germany, which also becomes its own center of gravity. So it's not like, I think in a sense, it's less unified than the scientific community now is, in a sense. I would say. It's difficult to compare like for like, but I would say it's more regionalized.
Yeah, and even like Hook's a great example, but I feel like looking back at a lot of these titans that they were working in a lot of different sciences at once too, which is really unique. And you
Mhm.
again, just like you don't see somebody putting out world-class music and world-class science, you don't see scientists publishing world-class findings in multiple. I mean, Hook came up with all of our basic elastic mechanical ideas. He gave us the basic spring equation. He also seems to have perhaps come up with the inverse square law of gravitation, which he gave to Newton. Maybe. I
Yeah.
mean, he was all over the place, right? It's kind of hard to imagine that kind of thing. And I wonder if that cross pollination allowed or afforded the glue that held people, since everyone was paying attention to everyone else's science, that there was more. Things just held together more. The consensus was maintained more by people being aware of other sciences and not being stuck in their own specialties.
To give people a context of the depth of what Shiloh's talking about with Hooke, if you open up his Wikipedia page, there's an entry of all of the sciences in which he participated: astronomy, mechanics, gravitation, orology, microscopy, paleontology, geology, and memory.
Yeah, it's hard to. I don't know. I'm like very romantic about this. I'm like, wow, like what a beautiful time to just be able. I love it because I love to study all these subjects. That's why we have this podcast, right? We're just interested in all these different things, and we do tons of music too. So I get it, and I'm just like, I just can't imagine that being professionally viable though. At the same time.
I think so, yeah. And Hooke is also so funny. So his micrographia, he says these things like, this is what it looks like under the microscope. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. You can make your own microscope. And then he gives a whole thing about how you have to make your own microscope. And to be honest, I thought, uh, you could actually use those things to make your own. So these people, like, one thing to realize is they made their own microscopes. He made his own, like, really very finely weighed system to, like, really be able to weigh things to a greater extent than you would normally have. He made his own scientific instrument. So there's that too. So these people were also really handy as well. On top of all the other things.
Was there specific large institutions that were arising during the Enlightenment that accelerated the rate at which people were able to build on knowledge? Because you were saying that Oldenburg was involved in the publications of the Royal Society. And the Royal
Yes.
Society to me seems like a really ancient ancient. It seems like a really established institution for collecting these ideas as they come out and giving people a central place where they can come. And if there's a difference between England and the continent, is that because there was a different, distinct society, like a Parisian one or something, that was doing the same thing, but for the continent?
Yes, there was a Parisian one, and I forgot the name. It's Académie des Sciences, maybe? I think
I
so,
think so,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so Fontenelle, for example, who gave us a lovely astronomy book, and a book about religion, which is also very interesting. He was somebody who like had a central role there, and he would write obituaries for various people, to just give people away, like, oh yeah, Gottfried Leibniz died, and this is why his work is important. So you had in France, you had these centralized societies, because France also was a centralized country. It's always been, actually, since the early modern period, very centralized around Paris. So the French say like this Paris, and then there's the province, which is everything. That is not Paris, apparently, which is the majority of the country. So you had that, and in the United Kingdom, you have variety. So you have the Royal Society, but you also have like astronomical societies and paleontological societies. And the other thing, so you have these larger societies, but the other thing to realize is that there were also smaller societies that really were very, very fertile in terms of what they brought as output. To give you one example, unfortunately, I'm blanking on the name, but in Scotland, uh, you had in Edinburgh, you had a dining club, and you had people like Adam Smith and James Hutton. So Scottish Enlightenment. So we're talking now about the mid 18th century, who would go and eat dinner every Thursday. And James Hutton is one of the founders of paleontology and geology as disciplines. So they would talk about these things together. And Hutton had this idea that the Earth is not 6,000 years old. The Earth is millions of years old, maybe even older. So you have that dining society that I'm fortunately forget the name of, where you have all those ideas that cross fertilize. So you could just have like small local initiatives where lots of interesting stuff happens. I think that Jonathan Israel does a good job of sort of outlining how in the Dutch Republic in the mid 17th century, you also had like these loose associations, like the collegians, who was sort of like, they were Christians, but very open-minded, and they were interested in all sorts of different ideas. And they would also gather and talk about like, how do we interpret the Bible, but also like, what does Descartes have to say and the principles and things like that. And they would discuss that. So I think that sort of thing that we now refer to as seniors, this sort of like the scene where a few people come together, but somehow their minds really work well together and give us great ideas, are, I think, as important as these sorts of really large-scale societies that really institutionalize and they have a magazine or a journal that's printed and so on.
So in the, I looked it up, by the way, the Scottish Society, I think, is called the Oyster Club. Does that
Oyster
sound right?
Club, that's it. I thought
Thanks.
it's not, it's something to do
Like,
with
it can't possibly be the Oyster Club,
food,
but it
but
is.
what food again? Yeah.
The Cake Club. So, like, it seems something very important happened during the Enlightenment that is distinct from what happened before and yet is deeply influenced by what came before. And when we originally sat down to have this conversation, when we planned it out, we were sort of talking about what made the Enlightenment so special, like how it emerged. And so we have these things that I feel like are characteristic of the Enlightenment, which is societies where people are gathering, they're exchanging ideas, they're publishing their ideas, and now you have these cultural groups which are competing in what amounts to an evolutionary landscape. Like, I hate to reify the idea of a culture as being something that can compete in an evolutionary landscape, and yet it seems like this is what we're pointing to. You have the big organizations that collect a broad spectrum of ideas, and then you have the smaller institutions that are producing the like basic building blocks, the basic research that's going to go and eventually be published at these larger institutions. And so what's the lead up to that like? From the Renaissance to the Enlightenment? Like, what are the things that happen that really make this possible?
Now, that's something I hope to investigate in my next project. But yeah, you're right. So just a short answer is, if we look at the Renaissance, then you have several things that I think are interesting to think about. So one thing is, I think very important is that Renaissance philosophers, maybe because they were just like slightly obsessed with magic, and I know this is like Frances Yates. I'm a huge fan of her work. Like, I know people have been like criticizing it to death, but I think that this is true, that this interest in magic and in alchemy was really something that helped them to go loose off the sort of like, oh, but is my natural philosophy really in line with Aristotle? Is it really Aristotelian, or am I doing something wrong? Now, obviously, here's where there is an even greater continuity, because in, I think, 1277, maybe you need to look that up, there was a sort of edict that said that actually against some use of Aristotelianism in religion. I forgot the name of this. So 1277, thereabouts. So you had a papal decree that said basically Aristotelianism in religion can't really work. And so that sort of loosened that bond that you have in scholasticism between Aristotle and religion. And so once that bond is loosened, all of a sudden you don't have to have this unified worldview, because a lot of what I think is genuinely different and what makes Renaissance different is that you can have multiple worldviews. That is not just like, okay, this is the worldview. All of a sudden, there are many worldviews possible, right? Then you have Reformation worldviews, which are different, but that's just the opening act. because all of a sudden, all sorts of even weirder worldviews become possible, right? So I think at first, if you have like the Renaissance makers, like somebody like Ficino or Pico della Mirandola, like they did talk to each other, of course, and they had like little groups as well, like the Camerata, the Florentine Camerata, where musicians and theorists and people in rhetoric, etc., would come together, and that only intensified over time. So rather than being this sort of hobby thing that you did by yourself at home, it became this sort of thing that you did in groups or that you talked to other people about. So I think that the sort of the flow of these ideas that really are against the sort of unified medieval worldview, which basically was shattered to pieces around, around 1500 already, I would say, when you have this early Reformation ideas, when you have that, that is, I think, that something that characterizes the Enlightenment, that we genuinely try to look at those ideas, not in our own idiosyncratic way, but that we're trying to think like, does this idea make sense? And that's still something we're doing today, right? We're still looking like, does it make sense? Like, what does this idea mean?
So, why was it?
Oh, I do not hear you. You hear me?
Sorry. That's probably my fault. Can you hear that better?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, the cable sometimes pops out. Why was the decline of Aristotelianism so important for this transformation to happen? Because as far as I understand it, Aristotle was very much a key for the establishment of Christianity as it emerged from like Greek and Roman tradition. And I know that he was lost for a long time and was only present in the Islamic world. And then around the 1100 and 1200s, people started to translate these manuscripts, and so they kind of like recovered Aristotle.
That's right.
What was important about it for the Christians? Just to square people up.
So as far as I see it, and I would love for you to tell me that I see it completely wrong, is that Aristotle had this idea of the sublunary and the superlunary realms, which softened Plato's like very strict doctrine of forms, and so created a perfect immortal realm, and then a terrestrial realm, which seems like it fits really neatly with
just heaven and earth.
Heaven and earth, and like these ideas of there being a god, because Aristotle maintained the idea of the prime mover as being first cause, and so it's this unified figure that sits at the heart of Aristotelianism, which can map neatly onto, the Christian God.
Yeah, if I can speak briefly to that. So I think definitely. So we have a problem in that in the early medieval period, you have Christianity, and Christianity is the only game in town. Like basically, they did huge, horrible ethnic cleansings in in Spain. As soon as they managed to get control, the Christians got control back of the Islamic the places like Cordoba, etc., that were like under Islamic rule. And then basically it was like that, like Christianity was the only game in town. The only people accepting to that were Jews, who were sort of kept actually not even fully accepted, but sort of allowed to live sometimes until people got different ideas, like in the Middle Ages in England when they just were expelled. So there was that sort of thing. So Christianity is the only game in town, but the problem is that Christianity doesn't give you a good picture for science. It just doesn't, right? So there's some creationists who seem to think that it does, and they want to revive the pillars of the earth and the firmament and things like that, but it just doesn't work. So then you need something that actually scientifically works. And indeed, the thing that they eventually took was via the Islamic tradition. So if you look at Aquinas, all the time he's citing Ibn Sina. And Ibn Sina, and this is funny, he actually goes so much beyond Aristotle. So there's many things that Ibn Sina does not accept from Aristotle, but somehow Aquinas sort of papers over all of that. He talks then about the philosopher and Ibn Sina, and they all agree that this and this is in line with scripture, etc. And so a lot of that goes like that. But yeah, so Aristotle gave at least, plus then a few other things like Ptolemy, of course. Like, so Aristotle has his own picture of the cosmos, but Ptolemy is more detailed in the sense that you have like the Earth at the center and the planets going around the Earth and the sun going around the Earth. And it sort of gave a picture that at least helps to explain the phenomena. So there's this idea of like explaining the phenomena. If you just like without doing weird stuff in your attic, but just like looking out at nature and just the things you normally and naturally can observe without special lenses, without special experiments, it's going to do a decent job explaining that. And it gives a unified picture as well, right? It gives a unified picture because another element of that was the great chain of being, where we as humans fit in a bigger picture of like at the top you have God, and then you have all sorts of different classes of angels, and then you have us, and then you have like various kinds of animals, and then it goes all the way down to dirt. And porous dirt is, a sort of relic from that, right? So you have all that, and it's a beautiful unified picture where things have purposes as well, right? So, why do you have teeth that are shaped the way they are? Well, that's for chewing, right? And things like that. So that picture, I don't know where I'm going with this. That picture was something that worked, right? But I think that as people in the Enlightenment realized this picture just does not work. And they had different ideas about it, so that's the exciting time that it is to sort of see like what picture actually. I mean, there was no unified other picture. There were many different pictures.
Yeah, and so I'm trying to get to the bottom. I mean, personally, I don't know the answer to this, and I don't necessarily expect you to either, of why it was that Aristotle was the preferred philosopher at the time that Christianity was emerging as the state religion, and how it was that his ideas were then criticized by the Pope, and how it was that it took still another, like, if in 1277 the Pope is saying that there's Aristotle's not the right guy, 400 years later people are still being run out of Paris for criticizing Aristotle.
Yeah, and they didn't think this through, I think, like is the short answer. So I think one thing to realize with Aristotle, that even in the Islamic world where he was so important and where the influence goes via Spain and Northern Africa, even so, yeah. So even though that was the case, you always had Platonism. Platonism was always there as a sort of subcurrent. You have Neoplatonic ideas in, people like Augustine, so late antique scholars, and in some medievals have some Platonic thoughts as well. But then if you look at the Renaissance, like at people like Ficino, Pico, they were Neoplatonists. So they drew on that. So that already made them different because they went against this sort of general Aristotelian idea. And so I don't know, that's the thing, like I can't say, because as I said, like medieval period is not my specialization, but like why Aristotle was seen as so fruitful. But I think in part it is because Aristotle had a very detailed, so he had all these lecture notes. So a lot of Aristotle's writings are actually notes of lectures and notes of observation. So he had a very rich picture of like, this is what animals are like. This is what planets are like. This is like, he had a whole catalogue of things. Whereas if you look at Plato, well, there's a lot of political philosophy there. There's a lot of like guys talking about, like how can we make the ideal republic? Let's have some philosopher kings. And I mean, I'm sort of like joking a bit about it, but there's just a richer starting point, I think, with Aristotle. So that plausibly seems to me why he was preferred. But of course, their metaphysics are quite different. And so that will have an effect on how things go.
When you say that their metaphysics are different, I kind of viewed Aristotle as being somebody who emerged from Plato, and instead of accepting Plato's idea of forms, was like, there still kind of are forms, but there's also the first cause, which is God. And to me, when I look at their metaphysics, I identify that as being the key ingredient of difference. Is that accurate, do you think?
I think that's fine as it goes, but I think one important part, and this had a huge influence on medieval and early modern science, is that Aristotle has a clear idea of teleology. So, like, why are things there? Why do things
Cause.
go the way they go? And you just don't have that strongly in Plato, right? So you could say with Plato, oh yeah, there's the forms, and the things somehow strive towards the forms. Like, and how does this happen? It's a complete mystery. Whereas with Aristotle, it's almost like the laws are built in. It's like each thing has its own little law that it uses. Like, why does an acorn turn into an oak? Well, that is because it follows its oakhood. Like, there is an inherent essence of oakhood there, and that's why it grows like that. So there is a kind of, within the things themselves are liabilities, as Aristotle would call it, and potentialities. So it has powers and limitations. So like wood can burn, but metal cannot burn, and it's just within the kind of thing that it is. And you don't have that kind of detailed idea of powers, I think. Ancient philosophers can say something different. I think in Plato, like there are these forms that the things adhere to, but there's no clear sort of natural history that underlies that. And that is so different because once you drop Aristotle, all of a sudden it becomes completely mysterious. Like, how come our eyes can see? How come our teeth can chew? Right? So that's why that's almost a different topic. That like proofs for the existence of God that are based on that sort of thing, you only actually really see them very clearly in the early modern period.
So it seems like Aristotle emerged from Plato by looking at Plato's philosophy and being like, that's all well and good, but we need to figure out cause. And that hung around for a long time as being wrapped up in the church because he intimated that the ultimate cause was God. And then when you have the Reformation, it seems like all of a sudden you challenge the idea that the ultimate cause is God. And so this opens up the door to people being like, okay, so Aristotle was right about asking about cause, but now what if the cause is not what he came up with, which is the prime mover, but it's actually other stuff? And then this foment begins of like, well, without Aristotle as the lid to what we can think of, we can start to think about other things. And so Descartes comes up with this mechanistic philosophy, which is that there's not from reading Descartes, I feel like he still struggles with this idea of the prime mover.
Yeah.
But he pushes it as far away as he possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, this is so interesting. So I think, with Aristotle, you have all sorts of different causes. So you have like, I forgot the formal cause and the efficient cause, and you have all those different kinds of causes. Like, so it to explain why something happens, you can just use, the kind of causal explanation that is fit for that specific thing, right? But then I think one of the issues is once you start mechanizing the universe and everything becomes like dead or like sort of dead matter, right? Everything becomes res extensa. And for Descartes, this was certainly the case because he even thought that animals are not res cogitans. They are not thinking things. They are just purely mechanical. But then all of a sudden it becomes very strange. Like, okay, so why do they do these things? Like, why do they move like that? And so I think that one thing that people lost in the early modern period is a clear causal explanatory framework. Where does this cause come from? Because in a sense, this I think is an interesting sort of tension. On the one hand, we see the medievals as these super religious people, like these people were talking about God in every other sentence. But funnily enough, they could talk about like why are your teeth shaped like that? Like why do we breathe? Why do our eyes see? They could do it all without having to appeal to God. They didn't have to because they had all these other things like, well, the reason that your eyes see is that they are foreseeing. Like this sounds horribly circular, but in an Aristotelian way, it is not. That's exactly why. The purpose of the eyes explains why they are functioning like that. So that's that kind of explanation. Now we can't use that anymore. So now we have to use like weird backdoor. So some evolutionary biologists try to sort of like sneak teleology back into it. But in a sense, we just lost it when we no longer accepted Aristotle. And for somebody like Descartes, it was very difficult. Okay, so why do the planets turn around their respective stars? Well, you can't say because, well, that's just the sort of thing it is. That explanation doesn't work anymore. And Newton, of course, would sort of sneak God a little bit into that, but Descartes didn't do that. So he said, well, there's this sort of thing called the vortex, and it's like this kind of watery, like it's a bit like water. It's a kind of ether-like thing. And that's why these things move like that. It's just purely mechanical, like a clock. So he tries to get teleology out of this picture and just explain things like a big giant clockwork, basically.
And how does that get rejected to the point where Newton says, it's gravity, but I'm not going to explain the cause of gravity?
Yeah.
Which
So
seems to be actually the very modern take on the situation.
Yeah. So Newton is so interesting in that, and I've only looked a little bit into like how this is different, but he has some ideas. Like you have the whole correspondence between Leibniz and Clarke, and Clarke actually sides with Newton, and he sort of talks to Leibniz, and it's really funny. Like Leibniz thinks that if a world is perfectly mechanistically attuned, you don't need God to intervene specifically, right? It's almost like he's bungling. Whereas Newton says, no, you can sort of adjust things. Like that's not bad. Like, you tune instruments. I don't know if this is metaphor, but it's a metaphor I often think of. Like, is an musical instrument bad if it needs tuning? I don't think so. I mean, when you're tuning there, if you tune a lute, there's many strings. You think, yeah, it's a bit bad. But actually it's not, right? So there's that difference. Like all sorts of questions, even though it was a completely mechanical, it was a scientific revolution, it had a huge impact on theology. So theology in that period really is different. Like we tend to think, oh yeah, there's Christianity and it's this like unmoving block, but no, it completely changed in the 17th century. It was completely new, different thing.
New and different how? Where it's that Newton's able to bring God back into a mechanistic universe by saying that, well, nature is, but God's there to tune the instrument, so to speak?
I think, yeah. So many people, so this was a question, right? Like, what do we do with this? What do we do with this new world? And there wasn't a single new worldview as well. There were different theories. You had Newton, or you had Descartes' vortices, or you had then a bit later Kant. So you had all these different theories. And then the question is like, how do we deal with that, right? How can we think of, getting God into this picture? And that's why in the 18th century, you have like deists. So deists just say, God made it. And God said, okay, press the button, run the simulation, and well, don't touch it anymore. And they were very firm about we're not atheists. So you also had atheists, and that's interesting because when Newton wrote, atheist was actually like a word that just went bad. If you were an atheist, you were somebody who loved power and riches and were only interested in his life because, yeah, if you don't believe in an afterlife, you must be a really bad person who just chases like a sort of hedonistic pleasure at the moment. You'd be somebody who's completely unreliable. So if you see people in this period saying, I'm not an atheist, you have to sort of think that it's almost like you say, I'm not a bad person, right? So it meant something different. But gradually, there were real atheists. So you had, particularly in France, in the later 17th century, early 18th century, people saying, yeah, I'm an atheist. I don't think that there is a need for this God in these pictures that we're having, in this mechanical worldview. But then you had, on the other hand, people who tried to get God into it in various ways. So then all of a sudden, precisely because we have no good account outside of Aristotelianism about why your eyes can see. Like, I can't anymore say, oh, your eyes can see because that's their function. Their function is to see. No, that doesn't work because that sort of explanation is completely out of the window. Everything's purely mechanical and, so there's no purposes inside. So then it must be that God made your eyes to see. So that was the theory that many people. Newton had this sort of theory, but you also had like other people in different continents. So you have a variety of like what's called natural theology that actually really flourished in that period.
Go ahead.
It's interesting how the question of why the eyes see is tangled up with how they see, right? Because even today, you can give a nice mechanistic explanation for how the photoreceptors work and what chemicals are involved and so forth. But why, right, requires you to do this evolutionary science, which isn't too far distant from, well, they're best suited to doing that, essentially. It's very similar in some sense, but it seems like these guys had the two kind of conflated together, how and why.
Yeah, that's right. The how was the why, or the why was the how, essentially, but you couldn't say that anymore. So we sort of look up a little bit in an anachronistic way backward, and we say, yeah, we have to wait. We have to wait until Darwin, and then we finally have an account of that. And that's the sort of thing that Kant talks about in the Third Critique, when he says we will not have a Newton of the blade of grass. And he sort of really honestly says something like that. So in the Third Critique, that he says, we can't have that kind of explanation. Now, Kant had a theory about why this was. So he thinks that causality, that this sort of causal explanation, is something in your mind. It's something in your mind and it structures your thinking. So that's why, actually, when you put that in a scientific theory, it's basically something of the structuring of the human mind that you put onto the world. And even now, we're sort of we know that this is actually probably true. I think this is broadly speaking true, but it makes you uncomfortable as well, right? To think like, I feel like we often want to try to get to the real, right? Beyond our human categories and so on. But I think Kant was actually right. Why we care about causes is because our minds look for causal explanations.
Which is kind of ironic because despite that transcendental idealism, he's still making up these pretty robust theories of nature that people sort of stand by to this day.
That's right. Yeah. I don't know how. So if you look, you referenced his theory about his nebula hypothesis about that those nebula that you see in the sky, they're actually are galaxies like our Milky Way. That was his theory. And he proposed this in 1755 in Theory
Yep.
of the Heavens. And actually took until 1920 that people actually had telescopes powerful enough to show that he was right. And there was controversy until that point about what those nebula were. So I think that's quite astounding, right? That Kant, on the one hand, he has this sort of really pessimism, I would say, about how far science can go. And on the other hand, he really contributed to it. And he wrote this really crazy treatise on volcanoes on the moon. Are they a thing? Like that's something that I don't see philosophers do these days, about writing about things like that.
I think that this is a really good place to take a 10-minute break because there's a branch point here that relates Descartes, Newton, Kant, and modern science. And it would be cool if we could maybe see if we can map a tentative course through all three of those ideas and how they evolved to produce what we see today as science.
Great. Okay.
Hey there, we're having our first live event this April 7th and 8th in Austin, Texas. If you can afford to come on out, I would love to see you there. We're going to actually have the chance to get together and make some real-life friendships and put our heads together about some of the problems we've come across on this show. We're also going to have some incredible speakers, some of our favorite guests across the years, and we're going to be doing some workshops, hanging out at the beer garden at night, watching the total solar eclipse that isn't going to pass through America for another, 20, 30 years? So, don't miss it. Come over, check out the tickets, they're up here. And I will see you in Austin. We have this sense that Kant fuels, in some sense, Newton's ability to say, this is how gravity or X, Y, and Z phenomena unfold. We can mathematize it, but we don't need to explain the cause because the cause is unknowable. You could say God did it or something else, but it's not what the natural philosopher does anymore. And this seems like a reversion to the past, and I'm really curious if you have any insight into maybe it's a political motivation or there's some ethnic divide between the continent and the island, but why in the world people went with that as opposed to the Cartesian worldview? Was Descartes less of a handshaker? Was he a less robust politician, and was he just not as good at math? Like, what was it that led us to this Newtonian worldview that we still obey today?
Yeah. Descartes was a star, apparently. He was like a science star, like at the time, just like Newton in a sense, right? And Descartes was definitely great at math. Like he helped to revolutionize it. Like if you read his mathematical work, it's very elegant. But his vortices was just it. There were too many anomalies. So Newton talks about these anomalies. Like there's so much. Like if things are like these bubbles, so these vortices are almost like bubbles that sort of lie internested, right? And each of these bubbles is like a solar system. And to explain why the planets go around the sun, you need these sort of like, yeah, hence vortices in French, tourbillon. It turns a bit like a carousel or something. But the problem is, what with comets, right? Comets, they keep on coming and going, and they seem to just cross the vortices. So what's up with that? That's an anomaly. You can't explain it. And people were actually, this was sad for Descartes, but people were super interested in comets. Comets were harbingers of misfortune. So it's not that people say, oh, fantastic, a comet. A comet was always a bad sign. Like, so Pierre Baye wrote this fun book about comets in, I think, 1682, because there had just been a big comet. So the big comet of 1680, called Newton's comet or Kerr's comet, was a comet that was so bright that by daylight you could see it pass, and you could see like the tail of the comet in daylight. And so people were very superstitious about it, and Baye wrote this thing about like, yeah, comets are not like, they're purely natural phenomenon. And actually Newton agreed, comets are purely natural phenomenon, and so we need them to fit in our theory. So again, sort of going back to what we earlier were saying about like what I think is different between medieval and early modern science is that people, rather than say, oh yeah, there's all this stuff, and then there's comets, but let's just not talk about these things. No, let's talk exactly about these things. Let's talk about the things that can falsify your theory. So if we think about that now, we say, oh, it's Karl Popper. He talks about falsification. But actually, if you look at it, it goes a lot further back. So Bacon, for example, Francis Bacon, talks about this in his new organ of science. Like, you have to find evidence. But importantly, you have to guard yourself against what we would call confirmation bias. So you have to try to find disconfirming instances. And I think that Descartes was just unlucky that there were several things that people found highly salient, like comets, that really didn't fit with his theory. Whereas Newton has a problem because what's gravity, right? It's action at a distance. This is very mysterious. There is no action at a distance. So you just have to go with it and say, okay, it's action at a distance. I can't explain it. It's there. And this was something that bothered Newton at the time, but it was better than these vortices where you don't have this problem because you have a kind of matrix in which things are moving. And actually these ether-like ideas, you keep on seeing them coming up, right? Even in early 20th century astronomy with people like Lorentz, for example. I think Lorentz also had that, right? So you do keep on seeing
Which is
that.
mathematically equivalent to Einstein's general relativity. I think most people don't realize that, but
Yeah.
it's an equally successful theory that has a mediator, which is fascinating.
Yeah, so it's really up to, it's partly, I think, it's partly historical accident with, even though the early Enlightenment, actually the focus really is on the continent. Later Enlightenment, I do think it shifts more towards the island. So I think there's that. So, but next to that, there's also this problem of anomalies that I think genuinely, anomalies are worse than weird things you can't explain, but that do make sense in the theory.
Well, it's really interesting, too, to me, because if you think about the way that most textbooks explain general relativity, it's basically these little vortices. Like, they use like a warped tarp, usually. They'll put the Earth, and it's kind of squishing the tarp down, and the planets are going, right? It's like, it's eerily similar, but the only difference is that you have this kind of magical substance called space-time, which is, takes some calculus before you try to understand it kind of thing. It's wild how it just won't go away at the same time.
It won't go away. And who knows? Who knows what the future brings? We have all this dark energy still to account for and all this dark matter. So,
Exactly, yeah.
yeah.
I have this feeling that Kant is really, really important for cementing this perspective, because Shiloh and I have an arc for the way that these pieces fit together, which is that in many ways, mathematics is very mystical. Like, if you look at the project of science, it is a very material discipline in general.
Up to a point.
Right, exactly. And the point is that when you get to the bottom of physics and you start asking questions about, like, okay, well, what is that? What is that? How does that work? Like, how does magnet work? What is electricity? What is gravity? What is light? You get fields. There's the electromagnetic field. There's the gravitational
You just get
field.
statistics at some point, essentially.
But I think that that's what the field is.
Yeah, of course.
The field is a statistical analysis of the force that you experience at different points relative to some location. And so when you dive down to the bottom and you really press somebody against the wall and you're like, what is the field? They're like, it's a bunch of measurements.
Or predictions.
Or predictions. And you're like, okay.
It's a bunch of effects. I think that's the
It's a bunch of effects. Yeah. Okay. Which come from measurements which are then turned into predictions. And they're very effective, right? Because if you have a magnet of a specific conformation, of a specific amount, like a specific Gauss number, you can predict the way that that magnet is going to behave relative to other objects that you bring around it. So it's an astonishingly predictive theory. But when you pin them down and you're like, where does the math come from?
What is the cause?
What is the cause? There's this point where they're like, well, the math just is.
Well, they're like, that's a philosophical issue. They're like, that's not our problem, essentially.
Yeah, I asked 35 scientists this recently with this paper. I'll send it to you when it comes out.
Please do.
Hopefully soon. And they are just stunned. They say, like, isn't it mysterious? And one scientist in particular, a very senior guy, has worked on black holes colliding. He was saying, isn't it strange that, there's no place for human minds in all of this? Like in the fields, you have different fields. There's field of electrons, fields of different bosons and whatnot. I don't know. I'm not a physicist, but you have all those different fields corresponding to elementary particles and to forces, right? But there's no field of consciousness. There just isn't, right? This is all there is. But at the same time, it seems like observation and consciousness plays a role in quantum mechanics, right? At least under some interpretations. So isn't that weird? Like he was saying, how does this happen? Like, where is this? And he actually landed on a kind of Cartesianism. He said, we have to go all the way back to Descartes. Descartes took out consciousness in order to deal with the material stuff. But then you shouldn't try to explain and say, oh yeah, consciousness, we're going to explain it with all this material stuff. No, you took it out first. And obviously he said, you could be like a panpsychist or whatever, but he was just like a full-blooded Cartesian and said, this is just a completely different thing that physics can never describe.
And yet we've somehow enthroned physics as the king of the castle, which is very strange.
Very strange.
Everybody seems to kind of wish they were a physicist a little bit, or at least point to the physicists for the ultimate cause.
Yeah.
But if you go back to this moment, the physicists essentially resigned themselves from this task.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful void left to be discovered, I feel like.
And I think that in order to deal with the void, we have to deal with Kant, because I think that I don't know Kant that well. But as far as I understand it, this doctrine of not being able to know the thing in itself, but you only can kind of see this secondary representation of the thing, is what is at the heart of physics right now, which is that you cannot see the thing that generates the math, you can see the math. And so we basically carry within us this crazy rupture where Newton, the smartest, best mathematician, comes up with something that explains how the planets move. And he's like, I can't explain why. It's not my job. And in fact, I don't think it's anybody's job. And so we're just going to do the math. And everybody's like, well, that's a little bit weird. And I think that there's some tension after that happens. But then when Kant comes around and is like, hey, no, it's okay. You don't have to worry about that tension because that's an unresolvable tension that we just have to accept. Everybody's like, fantastic. We can build stuff. Like, this math is really good. We can use it to build machines. We can use it to parameterize electricity. We can start the industrial age going. And everything is built after that fracture. And we're like, well, if we can build all this stuff, do we have to resolve the fracture? Like,
yeah. This is so cool. Yeah. Yeah, I think just a few things. Like, I'm no Kant scholar. Like, I always preface this when I know that it's somebody's turf, right? But Kant had such an enormous influence on, particularly continental Europe, but, more generally. Like, he had such a huge influence. And one reason was, I think, precisely that it was attractive to think that it's actually okay that even space and time, like for him, even space and time, and Newton was different in this, of course. Newton thought that somehow space and time were absolute, right? But Kant says they are in your mind, right? They are basically categories by which you, and then there's other things as well that we use, like causal reasoning. There's all sorts of like even the sort of basic grammar with which we sort of like the categories in Kant's terms. These are all things in our mind. And even indeed looking for causes is something that is in our mind. And once you go beyond, so for Kant, there is a correct way of dealing with these things. The correct way is dealing with these things is like just using those things in an everyday fashion to learn about your world. But then once you ask what makes the fields, what makes the math, Kant would say, you're now going beyond the bounds of reason. You're going to use those things for something inappropriate. So Kant was very anti-natural theology. So he didn't think you could do that. Like asking, like, where's the first cause? No, he says that's inappropriate, that's bad, you have to stop here. So at the end of the first critique, there's this whole thing about how you shouldn't do that stuff. And we still do it, though. We don't seem to have stopped doing this, so they keep on being like physicists talking about this, right? Sean Carroll, other physicists like that, they talk about this, so there is clearly still, we can't help ourselves. Kant would say, yeah, that's the transcendental illusion. You just can't help yourself. You just can't stop thinking about like what makes the fields, why is math the way it is? Why do we use math to understand reality? Like, isn't that mysterious? Like, it's a human construct and it can help us do all those things, right?
It's weird too because it ignores an entire dimension of existence too, which is qualitative in some sense, right? Like our human interactions, as far as I can tell, parameterizing what it's like to live a good life with math is a hopeless project, right? So it is really good at understanding some particular forms of patterns of behaviors in nature with respect to material bodies moving and so forth, but it's also it's clearly not the best way to understand the entire universe. And yet, it's still the king of the castle.
I think it's king of the castle because of something else that you've written about, which is magic.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have an inherent need for magic to live at the center of our cosmology. And as you abandon religion, you do not abandon your need for a supernatural cosmology. And if you can put mathematics, which is just this thing that emerges that cannot be explained and is yet the cause of everything that emerges, what you've done is you've taken what appears to be a rational cosmology, because science is, again, for most practitioners, a deeply, deeply mechanistic practice. Like if you ask a biologist how something happens, they don't point to like a rate enzyme curve and be like, well, there's just there's an enzyme field, and if you wait for long enough, then you'll get this amount. The field will generate this amount of enzyme or this amount of product. They're like, no. There's a little biological machine that has like a pocket, and it binds the compound, and then it breaks the compound, and so then you have, this is why the curve looks this way, and so.
Yeah, math has this valence to it, I think, that opens up the mystery for people that they intuitively desire really badly. That's why all of these like the least known parts of physics are the most interesting in the popular mind. Those are the ones that make it into the science fiction stories. Those are the ones that make the headlines, time warping inside of black holes and just stuff that just, if it was written in medieval times, you'd be like, that makes sense. Like, that seems like a very medieval idea. But it's still but it's the cutting edge because it's so valent. Like the mathematics of a singularity are what provide for a lot of this stuff. And the crazy thing is, if you're working in some mundane field like material science or biology, and you find a singularity in your curve fit, you're like, well, okay, my theory only fits between these boundary conditions here. But in physics, they're like, whoa, there's a singularity. That must mean physics stops working the way it used to. And people are like, hell yeah, that's incredible. Like that unlocks everybody's fantasy for all the things they ever wanted, It's just, I don't think that we can stamp that supernatural need out of ourselves as much as we try to. And without a church to be the authority on it, it's like, well, the physicists are the ones enabling that at this point.
I think that's right. I think it's interesting what you were just mentioning about magic. So there's several philosophers that I found unexpectedly. Before I embarked on this with writing Wonderstruck, I didn't realize I was so interested in this. Like the Wiener Kreis, the Vienna Circle philosophers. So we know those people like Schleck, Moritz, Carnap, and Neurath. We know them as these people who said, theology is bad, and any sort of religious statement is just unverifiable, and so we shouldn't talk about it. But actually, they were really interested in magic. So they in the Vienna Circle manifesto that they wrote in 1929, they say that actually after a brief metaphysical interlude, when we have all that bad metaphysical stuff of organized religion, we're going back to the time of magic. And they think this is a good thing because what is magic to them? It is to try to gain control over the world with things even as you don't fully understand them, powers that you don't fully understand. And that's exactly what mathematics is. Like, I don't think we fully understand it. It's this very powerful tool. It's almost like a magical tool, right? It's this sort of weird thing that we don't have, we don't even know what sort of applicability it could have in the future. So they saw that kind of parallel, where you try to control the world and you have this weird thing, and you just, you don't try to explain why, although you would like to, but somehow it works a bit like a magic spell works, or an incantation.
Yeah, and even the fact that it's written in these symbols that most people can't understand, it's just
Runes.
It's so esoteric, and I feel like, especially when I talk to one of my friends who's a mathematician, I feel like they really kind of like that aspect that nobody totally knows what they're talking about. Like it has that same power as the priests in Latin speaking to the masses, who didn't speak Latin or something like that. Yeah. There's something really obfuscating about mathematics at the same time.
This is an effect that happens on me sometimes on the podcast, where we'll talk to somebody who's really mathematical. And in the moment, I'm so occupied with trying to hold on desperately to the argument that they're making with the mathematical operations that they're talking about, that I have absolutely no capacity to evaluate, does this make sense? And then we'll make clips and stuff later, and I'll go back and I'll listen to the clips, and I was like, what was I thinking, not pointing out how absurd this is? Because there's this jump here that was made, and it doesn't connect to the previous three ideas, and so there's this obvious disconnect in retrospect. But at the time, my energy is so fully encompassed in making sure that I'm tracking what it is that they're saying, that I have no ability left to actually be able to evaluate the quality of the argument. And I think that that's the Rooney magic of it that you're pointing to.
Yeah. And that's been always a part of magical practice, right? So the difference between magic and science, if you look at that history of science, and I don't want to be one of those people who say, although I have great sympathy for it, that early modern science started with magicians, trying to, and alchemists, that there is something of that. There is something of that. So there is clearly that strand. I would say that strand did play a role, that those people sort of sat by themselves and did it sort of privately and obscurely. And yeah, I can turn lead into gold. I can make a potion that can make you live forever, but I'm not going to show you how. But then later, so Bacon Francis Bacon faults those people with it. And he says, yeah, they're sitting there like spiders, but you have to be like worker bees and work together. He makes that analogy. Worker bees who work together, and scientists are like that. Scientists are open and clear and transparent, and they work together. But then, with math, I feel like you keep on having this sort of like obscure, person by themselves doing obscure things. And of course, there is a shared element to it. But at the same time, it's kind of, I used to be part of a group of philosophers to study mathematical practice, and I'm still a little bit involved in that. That was something I did in the past. And it's amazing how much of accepting new proofs is sort of held together by trust and tape or something like that. Like often it's very difficult to evaluate somebody else's proof, and it will take months to actually properly comb through and to see if it's all okay, if there's no problem. So when a new proof comes out, then it's often like, oh yeah, this guy's Andrew Wiles. He'll know what he's doing. And then a while later they say, oh no, look, there's a problem there. And then, yeah, problem fixed. So there is that element of obscurantism, I think, that still plays a role in that discipline, precisely because you have to be so deeply into it. Like even other mathematicians have difficulties understanding the proofs that are made, even if they're transparently shared.
Do you think that there was a difference in the relationship that Descartes and Newton had to magic as this integral pillar of the world?
Newton was much more sympathetic, right? He was an alchemist, as people will say. He was an alchemist. Whereas Descartes, so to my knowledge, he wasn't into that sort of stuff. So I think maybe Newton was okay with a bit of mystery, in the sense that I think Descartes didn't like insecurity all that much. Newton, I think in some respect, was much more comfortable with reasoning that we would now call bad. For example, why are all the planets in the same plane? Must be God. Like now we say, that's God of the gaps. But Newton was comfortable with that sort of thing. Whereas Descartes really wanted this sort of really clear picture where you do have God as a creator, but ultimately God is completely mysterious. So he had these sort of occasionalist ideas, like God could do whatever God wants. God's will is ultimately, it's hard to discern. Like this is why we have to learn the laws of nature, because we can't a priori say, oh yeah, God in his infinite mercy would certainly not have done this, but that. You don't know what God wants. So for Descartes, God, I think, is this very remote, like he was not an a-religious man, but God is this very remote, difficult to grasp figure, right? Whereas for Newton, well, Newton was an unconventionally religious man, right? He was not a Trinitarian. He didn't take the final, how do you call this, the final rights. He didn't want them, which I think is interesting. So he was very heterodox. But in a sense, I think that he did integrate God somehow. In his picture of the world, maybe, I'm not going to say better, but in a sort of more integrative way than Descartes did, is my sense looking at them.
And you think that that is what appeals to people across the ages in terms of why the Newtonian worldview is the bedrock for modern science?
I don't know. I think maybe.
Well, I think that it must. Like, think about how lacking in wonder a purely mechanistic universe is.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something too, that I don't think that Descartes completely removed the wonder from it. He put it in a different place. So from my reading of Descartes, he is very much a fan of the concept of hypothesis, that you could have a statement in your theoretical explanation which was not proven to be true, but if it was true, would be sufficient to explain the phenomena that you're trying to explain in your theory. Whereas Newton is very much like, hypotheses are garbage. We can only talk about what we can actually show. And so the gap is, for Newton, that I don't have to explain the cause of this. And for Descartes, it's like, well, I'm explaining the cause, but I might be wrong about this one part about it. And so they're like two different locations for the uncertainty. And for whatever reason, the Newtonian version appeals across the ages.
I wonder if it's not just also part of just historical luck. that Newton came in that particular period, was able to deal with anomalies that people really cared about. You had also Huygens with his astronomical observations just 10 years or so before that really sort of helped to like cement this sort of like Newton came at a good time when you had actually more access to better astronomical observations than Descartes had, right? Descartes, the telescopes were also a little bit crappy in the 1650s, whereas in the 1640s, whereas 1680s, they're pretty good. So, I mean, there was a lot of just like the lens quality increased quite dramatically in those few decades. So there's just that. And I think next to that, yeah, Descartes does have a place for wonder. So if you read his The World, so his that he didn't dare to publish, you do see that he like uses he says like I'm not going to explain everything fully to you because I want to take you on this adventure. I want you to think along with me. He had this whole pedagogical idea that we have to learn from nature not by just cramming things into our head but really trying to experience things. He has a beautiful psychological theory of wonder that I use in the book. So I think Descartes actually, even though he was a little bit sort of in two minds about wonder. Like he thought it was bad to keep on wondering. Like if you know, stop wondering, right? But he does think it is important at the point where you have no knowledge. He doesn't think it's bad. Like now, and I think that's such a great idea. Like I'm hoping that we don't lose this idea. But now, maybe because there's a certain hostility in interactions, like when you do a lot of public philosophy. At least I notice that if you say something wrong, and I've been worried because we've been really gone into the weeds and details, and I'm thinking, yeah, was this condemnation of Aristotle, was it really set 1277, or did I say a wrong date, right? So I'm worried because people will say, why are you a philosopher if you get all those things wrong, right? But Descartes thought it was not bad not to know and then to want to know. Like it's okay. It's ignorance per se is not bad if you're willing to do something about it. If you're willing to realize that, yeah, I don't know, and now I begin the process of learning. And I think that's so valuable, right? So now we're sort of always trying to say that we know, and I think we should sometimes just say, I don't know. We
Yeah, I
should
mean,
say that
I
more.
feel like right. I feel like the problem of dark matter and black holes and so forth would be a lot more quickly remedied if they were just referred to as parts of the theory that don't make sense. Like, hey, gravity doesn't seem to be making sense all of a sudden out here. What else could be going on? As opposed to like reifying it into this magical substance that's causing the effect somehow. It's like,
Mhm.
no, like we just don't know what's going on. Like whenever you see these dark and black and all these things, it's just that's exactly what it is we don't know. And that's
Yeah.
got to be okay.
It's got to be okay at some point, like, and then you begin the process. So Descartes thinks there's some things you can't know, like some elements of God, for example, will be unknowable. But this, you can go far, starting from this position of wonder and ignorance, and then sort of building yourself up, like he did actually in the meditations. Like, okay, what do I know? What do I know? And there's just this tiny thing, but it's important. Namely, I know I exist. Okay, and then from there you start up. So it's almost like he has this image where you sort of use like how do you call that? Archimedean sort of
The lever.
lever, yes. And then you sort of pull yourself out, basically. Like the better way to think about this than bootstrapping, where you actually can't pull yourself up by your bootstrap, where you can actually use a lever.
I think you're totally pointing to something that's really an important distinction between the wonder in Newton and the wonder in Descartes, because the wonder in Descartes appears to be wonder at the possibility of knowing.
Mm.
And the wonder in Newton appears to be the wonder at the void.
Mm-hmm.
And one seems to be like, no, we can understand it, and these are the first principles, and it has to be mechanistic, and it is our job to put together these theories. And with Newton, it's almost like he manages to manifest the void in mathematics. And what I mean by that is he finally takes what is seen, right? Because people have known that a ball thrown will follow a certain trajectory for a really long time. But prior to Newton, all of mathematics is static.
Mm.
And Newton and Leibniz are the first time that you have a mathematics that's able to actually be in motion. And so and that coalesces the void into something that can be manipulated and moved around and wondered at in a very different way from Descartes, who's like, yo, I don't have the math, but I do know that there's rules for how we should explain this. And it's objects touching each other.
Yeah.
And so he's like, the immense effort of putting that theory into place is where Descartes views the wonder. He's like, if we take up our minds and we put ourselves to this, perhaps one day we will have something that holds. While Newton is kind of like, hey, I've made a tool. This is a fantastic tool. And everyone's like, wow, that is a fantastic tool. Let us go wonder at its power in the world.
Yeah. The calculus is so important, right? In us thinking about things that move.
Massively. It's like, I think that it is the technology that allows us to stop thinking about why they move. I think it's literally like the invention that allows us to be like, who cares? It moves. This is how it moves. And I can predict how it moves and I can build something off the back of that.
Yeah. It also helps us to think about things that I think people found very difficult to think about. So already in medieval times, you have these things like you swing things around, right? A ball moves around. But with calculus, you can sort of see that there's aspects to this. The acceleration of the thing is not just the velocity, but also the direction, right? Both of those. And that's, I think, just genuinely changes your way that you look at the world. It's very different. All of a sudden, you get all these mysterious questions, right? Like I think it was Fermat who wondered all of a sudden, before this wasn't even a question, like if you have light that refracts, it refracts in such a way that it's not entirely straight, but the calculus predicts that this is the most efficient way that it refracts, right? And you can use a sort of, I don't know if this is from Fermat himself, but it's like an interesting analogy. Like imagine that you see somebody drown, right? Somebody's drowning, and you run at the side of the sea, and you have to at some point get in there, swim, save the drowning person, and come out again. So you have a different medium, and you can calculate with calculus the best path to take. Like when do I diverge and go into the sea and go back out again? And light does exactly this when it goes through like water and then out of water, and it takes exactly the shortest time. And people were all of a sudden wondering, how does light know how to do that? Like, it's sort of very mysterious, even though you could just as well ask, how does the apple know to fall down? Right? So you get all these mysterious things. I think once you really start describing motion, that people start wondering, okay, what is going on with this mechanistic universe? Like, right? How do these things do these things? Like, it becomes very mysterious. I think this somehow relates to this sort of late emergence of panpsychism that people are now sort of talking about. Every 10 years or so, panpsychism comes up. Like, of course, the light knows how to do it because it's all conscious. Like, I don't want to make fun of panpsychism, but I think that it sort of comes out of this, the way that we describe things.
I think there's an aspect of saving face too. Like I get this sense in reading Newton that like he was a little pissed off that he couldn't explain light with his corpuscles and so forth, and gravity, that he didn't have a cause, and so he's kind of like, well, I feel like in between the lines he's like, I don't know how it works, so nobody should work on this. Like it's not something that we should deal with as long as we can describe it mathematically. And I see the same thing happen in the 19th century when people are trying to find the ether and they can't detect it. And so Einstein comes along at this perfect moment where he formalizes things in such a way. And of course, there's lots of other reasons why Einstein rose to preeminence, but he formalizes motion in such a way that doesn't require a mediator to be introduced into the model. And everybody's like, great, thank God, because we couldn't explain it anyways. And so now we can just forget about that problem. And it's almost like this math is almost like comes to the rescue in all of these occasions where it's like, oh, well, we couldn't figure it out. And so we can, but we're still important and we know how to do things. And this is an amazing technology. And
I think that the reason that math comes to the rescue has something to do about the way that science is instrumentalized in the world.
Yeah.
where there's almost like two different kinds of science, the philosophical science and the engineering science. And the engineering science depends fundamentally on having math that works and predicts.
Entirely.
Entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Entirely in the sense that like you can't do it without
That's
it.
all you need. Yeah.
Yeah, because like we have friends that are engineers and they're just basically wellsprings of information about how a given system will unfold as long as it's within their domain of expertise.
According to the relevant parameters.
Yeah, like we've got a friend who's a civil engineer and he can look at a bridge and he can be like, okay, well, it's going to fail here, here, and here because of what I know about the parameters of the materials that they're using inside of this bridge. But the scientific philosopher would have like they're not tasked to the building of the bridge. They're tasked to asking deeper questions that
Right.
technology can't wrestle with. And whenever you come up with a new mathematical technology, what you do is you create the opportunity to say, well, we don't have to wrestle with those questions because look at the shiny things that we have. Or the
Mhm.
destructive things that we have, right? Like quantum physics and atomic physics, you can't take that apart from the nuclear bomb and the atomic age and the age of material science and chemistry and
Mhm.
plastics and just everything that happened from Einstein to today appears to be tied directly to this mathematical innovation. And everything that happened from Newton to Einstein seems to be directly tied to calculus.
Yeah.
Like Maxwell can't do what he does without calculus. Faraday can do what he does, but Maxwell can't.
That's right. And it's funny to say that calculus for the longest time was on really shaky foundations. Because with differential calculus, you have like the way Newton, I think it's Newton and not Leibniz, shows us like you have these strips that are really thin under the curve, right? And in the end, you have strips with like length 0. But if you're then doing dx over x, aren't you like dividing by 0? Right? No, we're not dividing by 0. We're not dividing by the infinitesimal, except like in the 18th, 19th century, people said, no, there are no infinitesimals. So actually it was it was a very elegant, handy tool, but it had huge problems. It had huge conceptual problems, and it took mathematicians until I think well into the 19th century to figure. I'm not an expert on the history of calculus, but to my knowledge, it took quite a while for them to figure this out. So that's an interesting aspect as well. Like we have this math, but the math itself is not like this completely unproblematic thing. It has its own constraints. It has its own theorizers. It has to be solid. Like if there's too many problems with it, it's going to be an issue.
Yeah, like it has to be instrumentalizable. Like if calculus
Yeah.
was a thing that wasn't useful in the immediate aftermath, then maybe it would have just been a paper that he wrote and it just kind of vanished and nobody really paid attention to
Right.
it. But it's like the art of taking it from a theoretical construct that is built off of what is observed and then turning it into something that can build things yet unobserved. It's this conduit of
Mhm.
inspiration to reality
Yeah.
that is transformative, that I think is what made it catch so much. And when you have Kant sitting around and being like, the math is enough, we're good.
But I guess it's worth pointing out that I'm skeptical of the proposal that the math is enough because, Anastasia came up with this really brilliant example, which is, well, we could have done biology the same way we did fundamental physics. We could have mathematized heredity to an extraordinary degree and come up with wave equations and probability fields for how genetics are inherited and had no concept of the actual DNA and the mechanical processes that underlaid it. And if we'd done that, would we have happened upon incredible technologies like CRISPR-Cas or ways to manipulate enzymes inside the cells and so forth? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe we'd still be in some dark ages where we would have these, singularity solutions to problems and have these spooky actions going on that were mathematically plausible but had no physical significance in the real world. And so I understand that math is superior technologically to a point, but when it comes to really making these quantum leaps, for lack of a better word, in our technological ability, I think that we run the risk of atrophying our imagination about the material processes that underpin those mathematics if we are completely deferent to the mathematics at the expense of our known understanding of the physical universe at the same time.
I think it's interesting you mentioned biology, because biology, of course, did have like a huge mathematization push, right, with the new synthesis in the 1970s. And even before, so you'd have the point of view. So you have people like R. Fisher, the geneticist, and they make equations. And those equations tell you. So you have the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which sort of says, like, if you have an infinitely large population, you see where it can go wrong, and there is no external pressure, then allele frequencies will remain constant. So let's say, for example, that blue eyes are recessive and brown eyes are dominant. This is a bit oversimplified, but you get the picture. And say that blue eyes will occur at 25% of people because you need 2 of the alleles. Then, in the absence of any sort of special advantage or disadvantage of blue eyes, they're going to stay at that frequency. And so that sort of thing, so you have work by Alan Grafen and that sort of thing, like they show how you can do a lot with math, like, and now as an evolutionary biologist, you can't do without math, but there's always been a minority tradition, people like Lewontin, for example, who say this is where it goes wrong. Like we're losing touch with how animals actually are whole, or an organism has a certain wholeness to it. Like it is an agent. And how can we talk about agents if you just have like gene frequencies? If you are just a bag of gene frequencies, like how can we explain? So there's no connection to ecology or to other disciplines anymore, or to psychology, because like how can I explain your mind if you're a bag of gene frequencies? Dawkins tried to do it and not very successfully. So you run into these issues like in biology. So this has been a continued thing about that there's too much mathematization or not enough mathematization. So in different disciplines, you get this.
Yeah, and like there were murmurings of, well, there should be some sort of genetic crystal that's accounting for the transmission of this. But I feel like they got lucky, right? This X-ray technology that allowed them to actually see it was in
Right.
some sense a product of all of the war tech that was going on, and they just kind of happened to have been able to see it. But if they hadn't had that technology, they might have moved on. Like they might have been like, oh, it doesn't matter. Who cares about the genetic crystal? That's a stupid idea. It's a very Cartesian idea. Forget about it.
There's a lot of things that conspired at the same time from where I'm sitting to make it so people started to care about the genetic crystal. And I think some of it had to do with microscopy, because you could see that there was something inside the cell and it was different in the nucleus than it was from other stuff. Cells that had, and so you could actually like play with cells as objects and take the pieces of them apart, which is very similar to the way that like the standard model of physics works, right? Which is that if you hit things together hard enough, you get these other things or events, and then you mathematize them, and then you come up with how all the particles relate to each other. But if you do the same thing to a cell, what you do is you break the cell apart, and then you have all these fractions that you can track using visible outputs. But physics at some point isn't visible. Like the atom is magic. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't ponder it, right? Like they even used to call electricity an imponderable substance. And that's meaningful because they're like, yo, stuff is happening that we cannot see. And the thing that makes it visible is the math. While in biology, they can look at the cell and they can be like, well, something is enriched in phosphorus inside the nucleus. It's called nuclein. And the people that were pushing statistics as the foundation of biology were eugenicists and social Darwinists.
That'll do it.
And they were like, it was Pearson. So like we use a ton of his statistical tests still, like chi-squared tests, and I think p-values come from a guy who was like, an
that was
ardent,
Pearson, right? Yeah, it was.
He was
because there
he
was
was
this guy. Oh, sorry.
he was an ardent eugenicist.
Yeah, that was just totally the norm, right? It's mysterious to read. Like when I first read about like Darwin, I got really interested in Darwin some years ago. Like who wouldn't? But then particularly the aftermath of Darwin, and I thought this is like a disturbing legacy. I can imagine if I were Darwin, who was an abolitionist and things like that. Well, a soft abolitionist, but still, I would be very disturbed by my legacy because the immediate legacy of Darwin is really grim. right? It's almost like if I'd lived at that time, I'd be creationist or something. Like I would say, I mean, if my values were broadly similar to how they are now, but that was genuinely what they thought, and they thought science is going to prove, we're going to implement these tools, and we're going to improve the human race. So that's how they did it. And yeah, the very first trying, also Galton, I think, to try to incorporate this Darwinian picture with heritability, which Darwin didn't do very well, was driven by these sorts of immediate societal concerns, that sort of in a misguided way, I think, trying to, improve humans.
And I think that that's why biology doesn't take a hold, or mathematics doesn't take a hold of biology, like, because people look at the implications and they have all these moral realizations about humans and society that are wrapped up into them. They're abolitionists. And so they want to grab onto the science, but they don't want to take with it all of the like horrible implications. And so they're like, look, we'll put the math in a bin and we'll use it for specific purposes, but it's not going to be the foundation. Like, we're going to continue along this physicalist line. But there's not the same sort of meaningful social construct that's built around mathematizing physics. Like, if you mathematize physics in fields, you like don't justify slavery as a consequence.
Right. Yeah.
But you
biology
mathematize
has always
biology,
had
you
that.
do.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting, an interesting disciplinary difference that biology has done this from an early period. And I'm wondering in how far this is just a historical accident. So unfortunately, at some point in the 18th century, race science became a really, really big topic. And it's only when you read 18th century books that like you can see the philosophers get more racist over time. This is very disturbing. Read a 17th century guy like Descartes or Spinoza, and they're totally not racist, or they don't talk about it, or if they do, it's in this very factual way. But then go a century later or a bit and read somebody like Hume, and you're thinking, oh my God, like you could stop here. Like, and Kant, of course, his lectures on anthropology. And Kant had a huge influence on, anthropology and how people, did this race science. So it's this hugely disturbing part of human history, but it is tied up with biology. And then later, when evolutionary biology came around, even though interestingly, Darwin didn't have this picture. So Darwin had this picture in the Descent of Man that humans descended in Africa from apes, and that all the humans did this. So this sort of like out of Africa, and then later there was all discussion about when did this happen, and he didn't specify that. But then if you go a little bit later, you have people who say, yeah, but some of us are more ape-like than others, right? But Darwin didn't make that claim. So there is this, I think it's a historical accident. Like I can imagine, I mean, you have to be a Philip Pullman to write this story where physics gets sort of wrapped up with this sort of, I don't know if there's inherently something about physics that makes it less vulnerable to that, or if it's a historical accident.
It's an interesting story. We were talking to a historian of physics at some point on the podcast, and she mentioned that the relativism was seen by the German people during, I believe it was World War II, as a Jewish science, essentially. And so they were actually still promulgating the ether theories, and that the backlash against ether theories after the war was in some sense in backlash against the Nazi ether science. And so there's like a whole landscape going on behind why we have relativity today as a result of this ethno-political strife from World War II, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have to read more about that.
I'm suspicious of the idea of historical accidents. Like, I really, I think that there's cause for everything, and I think that there's all these different features that conspire to focus all of their influence on a specific point in time, where it's these intersections of discovery and need and philosophy and it's like a sense of creativity that all determine the way that a discipline will develop. And if the discipline develops in that direction and it's effective for a long time, then there's not an urge to revisit the original conclusions. Like if you can throw away the ether and have physics work just fine, then there's not really a need for you to sit around and debate whether or not there's an ether. It becomes this category of question, which is like, well, who cares? And in some way,
until the current conception just completely falls on its face at some point.
And so it seems like an accident until you get to the point where you're at the end of the road and you're like, oh my God, we have to go somewhere from here. And then you do the historian's task of digging through the letters and piecing together how it was that this accident occurred. And you find that there are smoking guns. And you can change, you can like pick up before the smoking gun. It's like a save point in a video game a little bit. Where it's like, okay, well, I've finished this storyline. I understand how it runs. Like, let's go back to the beginning and go somewhere else. And I think that is why it's such an interesting time to be alive, because so many of these things seem to be coming to the surface as needing to be revisited. And you're studying this period of time where it was the time where we laid all of these myths down. Like, you are studying the source of everything that is striding across our intellectual landscape today, which is really
I've been thinking a lot about that recently, in terms of like how do things go, because I'm very interested in non-Western sciences, and things like science, right? So, like if you look at say Chinese astronomy or like in the Islamic world, you had medicine and things like that, and it all was working in a different way. So it did it differently, or like in India. And like I've often thought, like we have this kind of Whiggish story, like, oh yeah, inevitably we would have hit upon, this and that. But it's at the same time so very, context specific. There is a very specific European context for that, like can't be generalized. But at the same time, it's also global, in the sense that, those authors, they did know other cultures and other traditions. I mean, if you just look at Copernicus, who really lies at the very early basis of all of that, of thinking flipped about the universe, is very different. Copernicus begins his work on the revolution of the heavenly spheres. He talks about 5 Muslim philosophers who talk about all sorts of observations. And he says, look, like the sun has to be gigantic. And this particular author, I forgot who it was, Ibn Rushd maybe, has arguments for why the sun is really so much more bigger than the moon, even though they appear similar in size, things like that, right? So I think I get more and more convinced that these historical details really matter. And you're right that calling that accidents, historical accidents, is not quite adequate. But I think that there are certain paths that could have been taken that weren't taken that do have a big influence. And it could be sometimes a complete coincidence, right? You have to have somebody like Newton working in that space and time. If Einstein hadn't come along, it's not like he's some sort of placeholder figure. Oh yeah, there'd be other Einsteins. Like there weren't. Like maybe somebody else would have come along like that. So I don't know. So I think I want to still insist that there is something like historical contingency that is hugely important. While at the same time, there seem to be certain things in doing ways. Once you have the historical contingency, it becomes difficult to sort of move out of that and do different things, right? So yeah, that's sort of my initial thoughts on that.
Yeah, like we could have accidentally had Lorentz, and then maybe the ether would still be part of physics at that point.
But old Lawrence, I mean, like he,
it's possible. I mean, who knows? That would be like a tiny little accident. It's just interesting. I guess you can never predict how these things unfold, but
I propose, though, that if you were to go back and you were to look at Lawrence, you would be able to identify a thing of like, man, he was a real dick and nobody liked him. Or something of the sort, where it's like he pissed somebody off and like didn't
or just
know.
Wasn't as good of a networker. It could have been something really subtle too.
And so it's like, on one hand, it's an accident of history, and then on the other hand, it's also like a lesson of history. Because I'm always thinking about like, how do you take an idea that isn't popular yet and make it the idea that is not the forgotten, amputated limb of history, but is instead the thing that drives thought for the next 100 years. And I'm like, I think that you can learn from that moment where they pick Einstein instead of Lorentz if we can understand all of the ways in which it folds together.
I mean, yeah, I don't want to get totally into it, but it seems like Einstein was already pretty famous for his work with the quantum physicists with his photoelectric effect and so forth. So he was kind of the guy already, like waiting to take the puzzle and solve it. But I know you got to run. This has been a super incredible conversation.
Yeah, this was so much fun. Really interesting.
It's inspiring too, right? Because I feel like we are at this incredible moment. You see these headlines periodically, like science is ground to a halt. There's no more fundamental discoveries to be made. And I think that it's a much more charitable version of that is we're on the precipice of an incredible renaissance, not just in science, but in everything, really. And you see this distributed ability for, creators to make projects they could have never afforded to do before. People making films, like big films, like on their iPhone, people making world-class records in their bedroom. Like it's a really wonderful time. And so I think that by paying attention to what happened in the Renaissance with all of this thought, we can actually see something like a brighter future than the steady decline or slow plateau that seems to be occurring.
Yeah. That's a hopeful message. Yeah.
I believe it.
Yeah, good. I don't like to be too much of a doomer. Like sometimes I get to these doom cycles of, like what are we doing? What are we doing? But anyway.
Tell people where they can find you and about your books, because you've written a ton of books. You're very active, and I want to make sure that people can track you down.
Oh yeah, so you can just find me at helendecruz.net, and you can find me on Twitter at Helen Reflects. Remarkably, Twitter has not completely broken down at this point, so you can find me there, or on Blue Sky as helendecruz.net. And this is my latest book. This is all about wonder, and it's about Descartes' idea of wonder and how, we can use that to our advantage, to learn about the world, basically.
It's fantastic. And the book is called Wonderstruck.
Yeah, Wonderstruck. Yeah.
Excellent. Helen, thank you so much. It was really, really wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much, both. This was a great conversation, and I learned a lot from you guys. Thank you so much.
I hope we have a chance to do it again.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
See you guys.